Corydon by André Gide. Third Dialogue. I have thought a lot since yesterday, I said to Corydon on entering. But tell me, do you really believe the theory you put forward? At least, I am fully convinced of the facts which prompted it. As for claiming that the explanation I offer for them is the only possible one, or is even the best, far be it from me to be so presumptuous, but I shall add that, in my opinion, this is of no great importance. What I mean is that the importance of a newly advanced system, of a new explanation for certain phenomena, is not to be assessed solely on its accuracy, but also, and above all, on the impetus it provides to the spirit for fresh discoveries and new appraisals, should the latter invalidate the said theory, on the channels it opens, on the barriers it removes, on the weapons it furnishes. The essential thing is that it proposes the new, and at the same time opposes the old. Today it may seem to us that the whole of Darwin's theory is being shaken to its very foundations. Shall we for that reason deny that Darwinism in its day constituted a great advance in science? Shall we say that De Vries is right as opposed to Darwin? No. No more than that Darwin or even Lamarck were right as opposed to X. According to you, one could not even venture to say that Galileo. Allow me to make a distinction between statements of fact and the explanation that one gives to those facts. The explanation remains viable, but so far from always following the new observations, it often precedes them. Sometimes, in fact, often, we find theory ahead of observation, and it is only later that observations confirm the daring propositions of the mind. Take, for example, my own theories. If you will acknowledge that they show a certain initiative, then I shall be satisfied. Once again, facts are there which you cannot deny. As for the explanation that I give for them, I am ready to renounce it as soon as you produce a better. 1. Yesterday we were able to consider, he continued, the preponderant role played by the sense of smell, the sense which guides the instincts in animal intercourse. Thanks to this, the indefinite desire of the male is deliberately directed towards the female, and solely towards the female in rut. One can say, without too much exaggeration, that the sexuality of the genetic instinct, to use modern jargon, lies in the olfactory sense of the male. Properly speaking, there is no selection of the female by the male. As soon as she becomes in heat, he is drawn towards her, led by the nose. Lester Ward, in a passage I have not read to you, emphasizes the fact that all females are the same for the male animal. And actually, as we have seen, they all are the same, only the male being capable of variation and individualization. The female, to attract him, has no resources other than her smell. She has no need of other attractions. She does not have to be beautiful. It is sufficient that she be in good odor. Choice, if choice is not simply the victory of the fittest, choice remains the privilege of the female. She may choose according to her taste, and there we touch on aesthetics. It is the female, Lester Ward insists, who exercises the power of selection, and who, in consequence, creates what he calls the efflorescence of the male. For the moment, I shall not attempt to determine whether this superior beauty of the individual male in the majority of insects, birds, fishes, and mammals, and which may be the result of the female's good taste, is to be found also in the human race. I have been waiting a long time for you to reach this. Provisionally, since you are impatient, let me draw attention to the fact that the male nightingale's coloring is not much brighter than the female's, but the latter does not sing. The efflorescence of the male is not necessarily decorative. It is exuberant, and perhaps it is in song, in certain sports, or in intelligence that it finally appears. But let me keep to the order of my book, in which I broach this important question later on. Follow whatever order you like. I agree to your deferring all embarrassing questions, providing you come to them in the end, for I am determined from now on not to let you drop the subject until you have exhausted your science and your logic and fired all your arguments. But tell me how you begin the second part of your book. All right. I begin by stating that the sense of smell, which is of such capital importance in the intercourse of animals, plays no further role in the sexual relations of human beings. If it does intervene, then it is for supererogatory reasons. Is that really such a very interesting observation? To me, this difference seems so remarkable that I can hardly believe that de Gourmont, by making no mention of it in his book, and taking no account of it in his assimilation of man with animals, could really have failed to notice it, or would have simply omitted it, or very conveniently conjured it out of sight. I have never yet seen him embarrassed by an objection. Perhaps he did not attach quite the same importance to it that you do. Its importance will become apparent to you, I hope, when you appreciate its consequences, which I will try to explain to you. Let us put it this way. The woman no longer has the periodic odor of the menses with which to attract the man. Other attractions, no doubt, take its place. These attractions, whether natural or artificial, are not dependent on seasons and are not governed by ovulation. The desirable woman is desirable at all times. Let us go further. Whereas the male animal only desires the female, and she only permits his approaches during the periods of heat, man, on the other hand, usually abstains during the menstrual periods. Not only are these periods devoid of attraction, but they entail a sort of prohibition. For the moment, I am not concerned with whether this is physical or moral, whether one must see it as a temporary disgust of the flesh, a survival of ancient religious precepts, or a disapproval of the spirit. The fact remains that from here on, man is separated, and clearly separated, from the animals. Henceforth, the sexual appetite, while still remaining all-powerful, is no longer attached so closely to the olfactory nerves which hitherto held it on a leash. Now it has wider scope. Love, and I am loath to use this word already, but I have to sooner or later. Love at once turns into a game, a sport without closed season. Which does not mean to say, I hope, that everyone is absolutely free to play it as he pleases. No, for the desire will remain no less compelling. At least it will be more diverse. For the imperative to be as categorical, it will become more particular. Yes, particular for each individual. And furthermore, the individual will no longer crave vaguely for the female, but for one woman in particular. Spinoza said that the affections of animals differ from the affections of men as much as their nature differs from man's, and further on, when he is speaking more especially of humanity, that the pleasures of one man are as distinct from the pleasures of another as the nature of the one differs from the nature of the other. Adeo gaudium unius, a gaudio alterius tantum natura discrepat, quantum essentia unius ab essentia alterius differt. Montaigne, Pascal, and now Spinoza, you certainly know how to pick your sponsors. This gaudium unius, interpreted by you, tells me nothing of value. As Pascal said, I am very much afraid. But go on. He smiled and then began again. 2. On the one hand, constant attraction. On the other hand, selection, no longer exercised by the female in favor of the male, but by the man in favor of the woman. Have we not here the key to, or rather the justification of, the otherwise inexplicable preeminence of feminine elegance? What do you mean by that? That from top to bottom of the animal scale, we have had to acknowledge the astonishing supremacy of male beauty, for which I have tried to offer the explanation. That it is therefore rather disconcerting to find in human beings a sudden reversal of this hierarchy, and the reasons one has been able to find for this sudden reversal are either mystical or impertinent. To such a point that certain skeptics have asked whether women's beauty did not reside principally in man's desire, and whether... I did not allow him to finish. I was so unprepared to hear him produce arguments based on common sense that at first I did not catch his meaning. But as soon as I did, I was determined not to give him time to retract, and exclaimed, "You have helped us out of a difficulty, and I must thank you. I now realize that this constant attraction of women begins precisely where the other leaves off, and it is obviously of no small importance that man's desire is no longer dependent on his sense of smell, but on his more artistic and less subjective sense of sight, and this, no doubt, is what permits the development of culture and art." I then let myself go with the confidence which this first sign of good sense had inspired in me. It is rather ironical to owe to a homosexual the first sensible argument in favor of what you call the preeminent elegance of the fair sex. For I have to admit that up till now I have been unable to find any other except in my own sentiments. I shall now be able to reread, without embarrassment, certain passages from Perrier's speech to the Academy, which you lent me yesterday. What passages are you alluding to? Pulling the pamphlet from my pocket, I read, "To watch the caressing colors of fine dresses playing in the summer sunlight, or under the chandeliers of a great ballroom. One would think that adornment had been the exclusive invention of the daughters of Eve. The silver, the gold, the diamonds, the flowers, the feathers, the butterfly wings. Men have not yet dared to trespass on the creation of these jewels, in which women's imaginations and their love of coquetry seem to express themselves. Their hats, so exquisite, witty, or triumphal. You have to excuse him. He probably saw all this at some fashionable gathering. There is an increasingly sharp distinction, at any rate, in our civilized countries, between women's taste for decorative apparel and men's detached attitude towards all forms of studied elegance. That is what I told you, that the efflorescence of the male is not necessarily decorative. Wait till I have finished reading. Even the somber costume of the middle class seems to be too cumbersome. It is made lighter and shorter until it is reduced to a simple jacket, so that at ceremonies where women are present, we appear like humble insects gliding amongst flowers. Flattering. This evolution is absolutely characteristic. It separates the human race from the higher animals as much as any of its physical or psychological characteristics. It is, in fact, the exact opposite of what occurs in most of the animal world, where the male is in all respects the favored sex, even in the lowest forms of life. Is that the passage which embarrassed you? May I ask why? For it seems to me, on the contrary, that it ought to have pleased you. Don't assume such innocence, as though it had escaped your notice that Perrier, while pretending to extol the fair sex, is really only extolling the veneer. Yes, what I called just now the artificial attractions. The words strike me as being dishonest, but I see what you mean. And now that I come to think of it, it is not very smart for a clever man to over-insist on this point, because to say to a woman, "What a charming hat you have," is not, after all, as flattering as to say, "How beautiful you are." It is even better to say, "How becoming your hat is." But is this all that upsets you? I seem to remember that Perrier, towards the end of his speech, drops the question of adornments and starts to praise the person who wears them. Give me the speech. Listen. "Ladies, you have triumphed with the clarity of your complexions, the crystal purity of your voices, the gentle elegance of your gestures, and those graceful lines which have inspired the brush of Bouguereau. What could you want prettier than that? Why did you not read those lines?" "Because I knew you did not like Bouguereau." "You are really too considerate." "Stop mocking and tell me what you think of all this." "I admit that, in effect, so much artifice so constantly summoned to the assistance of nature upsets me. I recollect a passage from Montaigne in which he says, 'It is not so much modesty as artistry and prudence which causes our women to be so circumspect in forbidding us to enter their closets before they are painted and prepared for their appearance in public.' I have come to doubt whether, in Pierre Louis' fantasy, Trifem, the custom of frankly exhibiting the advantages of the fair sex, and the habit of displaying themselves stark naked about the town and over the countryside, would not produce a contrary effect to what he seems to predict, and whether man's desire for the opposite sex would not be considerably cooled. It remains to be seen," said Mademoiselle Quinault, "whether all the objects which excite in us so many beautiful and wicked thoughts, because they are hidden from view, would not leave us cold if we had to contemplate them perpetually, for there are examples of such things. After all, there are tribes, and they are actually the handsomest, where the dream of Trifem is realized, or at least it was 50 years ago before the work of the missionaries, as for example Tahiti at the time when Darwin landed there in 1835. In a few moving pages he describes the splendor of the natives, and then adds, 'I was much disappointed in the personal appearance of the women. They are far inferior in every respect to the men.' Then, after declaring that they required adornments to compensate for this lack of beauty, he continued, 'The women appear to be in greater want of some becoming costume even than the men.' I was not aware that Darwin was a homosexual. Whoever said he was? Wouldn't one gather so from this passage? What? Are you forcing me to take de Gourmont seriously when he writes, 'It is the woman who represents beauty. Any divergent opinion will be held eternally either as a paradox or as the product of the most annoying of sexual aberrations'? Eternally seems too strong for you? Keep calm. As far as I know, Darwin was no more a homosexual than many other explorers who, traveling among naked tribes, marveled at the beauty of the young men. No more a homosexual than Stevenson, for example, who, speaking of the Polynesians, recognized that the beauty of the young men greatly surpassed that of the women. And that is precisely why their opinion is of importance to me, and why I agree with them, not as a Puritan, but as an artist, that modesty is becoming to women, and that some form of covering suits them. Quod decet. Well then, what is the significance of what you were telling me just now? That argument in favor of the elegance of the fair sex, which seemed to me so pertinent. I was going to explore the possibilities of this line of reasoning. When the female made the choice, or exercised, so to speak, the power of selection, then we saw selection working in favor of the male. Conversely, no doubt, it works in favor of the woman, when, as at present, it is the male who makes the choice. Hence the triumph of feminine elegance. Yes, that is as I had understood it. We have been in such haste that I have not been able to pursue my ideas further. I was going to draw your attention to the fact that whereas amongst animals the efflorescence of the male can only be transmitted to the male, women, however, certainly transmit most of their characters, including beauty, to their offspring of both sexes. The phrase is from Darwin. So that the strongest men, by choosing the most beautiful wives, are working for the beauty of the race, but not more for the beauty of their daughters than of their sons. You, in your turn, must be careful of reasoning in this way. Otherwise, the more you depreciate women's beauty in favor of masculine beauty, the more you will be showing the triumph of that instinct which still makes her beauty preferable to me. Or, the greater the expediency of ornament and dress. Ornament is no more than a spice. As for dress, it can amuse for a short while and can excite desire by postponing a more complete revelation. If you are not susceptible to feminine beauty, so much the worse for you, and I feel sorry for you. But don't go trying to convince me of general aesthetic laws based on a sentiment which, despite all you can say, will always remain a queer sentiment. 3. Is it then due to a queer sentiment that Greek sculpture, to which we must return each time we discuss beauty, shows the man naked and the woman shrouded, rather than recognize purely aesthetic reasons for the almost constant preference of Greek art for the figures of boys and young men, and for the obstinate shrouding of the woman's body? Do you prefer to see it, like de Gourmont, as the product of the most annoying of sexual aberrations? And what if I did choose to see it as that? Would you try and teach me the extent of the ravages of homosexuality in Greece? Besides, was it not simply to flatter the vicious inclinations of a few debauched patrons that these boys were chosen as models? And is it not open to doubt whether the sculptor was yielding to his own artistic instincts or to the tastes of those he served? After all, it is impossible for us today to take into proper account the various requirements and conventions which constrained the artist at the time, and which determined his choice, for example, at the time of the Olympic Games. Conventions which no doubt also obliged Michelangelo to paint not women, but naked boys on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, out of respect for the sanctity of the place, and precisely in order not to arouse our desires. Because, if like Rousseau one were to hold art partially responsible for the extraordinary corruption of Greek morals, or Florentine, for it is remarkable that each Renaissance or period of great artistic activity, in whatever country it occurs, is always accompanied by a great outbreak of homosexuality. An outbreak of all the passions, you should say. And when the day comes to write a history of homosexuality in relation to the plastic arts, it will be seen to flourish not during the periods of decadence, but on the contrary, during those glorious, healthy periods when art is most spontaneous and least artificial. Conversely, it seems to me that not always, but often, the glorification of woman in the plastic arts is a symptom of decadence. In the same way that in different countries where convention required the women's roles in the theater to be played by boys, we see the decadence of dramatic art beginning from the time when those boys are replaced by women. You are deliberately confusing cause and effect. Decadence began from the day when serious dramatic art set out to please the senses rather than the spirit. It was then, as a means of attraction, that women were introduced onto the stage, and you will never remove them from it. But let us come back to the plastic arts. I have just thought of Giorgione's wonderful Concert Champêtre, which I hope you do not consider a work of decadence, which, as you know, depicts two naked women with two young musicians fully clothed, grouped together in a park. From a plastic, or at least a linear point of view, no one would dare claim that the bodies of these women are beautiful. As Stevenson said, they are too fat. But what coloring! What deep, glowing, luminous softness! Could we not say that whereas masculine beauty is supreme in sculpture, the flesh of women, on the other hand, lends itself best to treatment in color? Looking at this picture, I thought, here indeed is the very antithesis of ancient art, the young men clothed and the women naked. No doubt there was a dearth of sculpture in the land which produced such a masterpiece. And a dearth of homosexuality. Oh, on that score, a small picture by Titian makes me hesitate. What picture? The Council of 30, which shows right in the foreground, although set to one side in shadow, groups of nobles, two here, two there, in postures which leave little room for doubt. Maybe one has to see this as a sort of licentious reaction against what you just called the sanctity of the place, but certainly some of the contemporary memoirs would lead one to believe that these habits had become so common that no more offense was taken at the figures of these noblemen than at the halberdiers who stand beside them. I have looked at that picture 20 times without noticing anything abnormal. Each of us notices only what interests him. But I will say that here and there, in this picture and in these Venetian chronicles, for example, homosexuality does not seem to me spontaneous. It seems bravado, an exceptional and vicious amusement for the debauched and blasé. And I cannot help thinking that in a similar way, Venetian art, so far from being popular and spontaneous, or springing vigorously from the very soft soil itself and from the people, as in Greece and Florence, was, as Taine said, complementary to the surrounding luxury, and was a form of pleasure for the nobility, like that of the French Renaissance under Francis I, which was so effeminate and so dearly bought from Italy. Try to disentangle your ideas. 4. Yes, I believe that the idealization of woman is the symptom of a form of art less natural and indigenous than that presented to us during the great periods of homosexual art. In the same way that I believe, and here you must excuse my temerity, that homosexuality in both sexes is more naive and spontaneous than heterosexuality. It is not difficult to proceed quickly, I said, shrugging my shoulders, if one does not care whether one is followed. But without listening, he continued. This is what Barrès understood so clearly when, wishing in Berenice to depict a creature of instinct, close to nature, he made her a lesbian, and the friend of Bougie-Rose. It was only by education that he succeeded in training her to heterosexual love. You are ascribing to Maurice Barrès hidden intentions which he did not have, of which perhaps he did not foresee the consequences, is all you are entitled to say, for you know quite well that in Barrès's first books the emotion itself is intentional. For me, Berenice represents, he says dogmatically, the mysterious force and impulse of the world. A few lines further on, I even came across a subtle intuition and definition of her anagenetic role, when he speaks of the serenity of her function, which is to bring life, everything which enters her, a function he compares and contrasts with her catagenetic agitation of spirit. Barrès's book was not sufficiently fresh in my memory for me to discuss it, but already he was continuing. I would be curious to know whether Barrès was aware of an opinion of Goethe's on homosexuality which bears a close resemblance to his own views and which was reported by the Chancellor Müller, April 1830. Let me read it to you. Goethe entwickelte, wie diese Verehrung eigentlich daherkomme, dass, nach rein ästhetischem Maßstab, der Mann weit schöner, vorzüglicher, vollendeter als die Frau sei. Your pronunciation is so bad that I can hardly understand. Will you please translate it? Goethe explained to us how this aberration actually arose from the fact that, from a purely aesthetic point of view, man was far more beautiful and more perfectly constituted than woman. That has nothing to do with the quotation you gave me from Barrès, I exclaimed impatiently. Wait a minute. We are coming to the connection. Such a sentiment, once aroused, easily turns into bestiality. Homosexuality is as old as humanity itself, and one can therefore say that it is natural, that it resides in nature. Die Knabenliebe sei so alt wie die Menschheit, und man könne daher sagen, sie liege in der Natur, ob sie gleich gegen die Natur sei. What culture has gained at the expense of nature will not be surrendered or given up at any price. Was die Kultur der Natur abgewonnen habe, werde man nicht wieder fahren lassen, es keinen Preis aufgeben. Possibly homosexual habits are so deeply ingrained in the German race that to certain Germans they appear quite natural, as the recent scandals in that country would lead us to suppose. But to a truly French mind, this theory of Goethe's remains absolutely staggering. Since you choose to introduce the question of ethnics, let me read you a few lines from Diodorus Siculus, who, to the best of my knowledge, was one of the first writers to give us information about our ancestors' habits. Although their women are pleasant, he said of the Celts, they have little to do with them, whereas they show an extraordinary passion for male company. It is their custom to sleep stretched on animal skins which cover the ground, with a bedfellow on either side. Is it not clearly his intention to discredit those whom the Greeks considered barbarians? At that time, these habits were not considered discreditable. Aristotle also makes an incidental reference to the Celts in his Politics. After complaining that Lycurgus had neglected the laws pertaining to women, he said that this led to great abuses, particularly in cases where men have allowed themselves to become dominated by women, which is a usual tendency in energetic and warlike races. I make an exception, however, of the Celts and of certain other nations where honor is openly paid to masculine love. If what these Greeks say is true, then you must admit that we have come a long way. Yes, we have become somewhat cultured. That is precisely what Goethe says. And therefore you ask me to consider with him the homosexual as a backward and uncivilized, well, not necessarily, but to consider homosexuality as a very fundamental and naive instinct, which would certainly provide some excuse for the fact that the inspiration of Greek and Latin bucolic verse was so frequently homosexual, verse which attempted more or less artificially to revive the simple modes of Arcady. Bucolic verse started to be artificial from the time the poet ceased genuinely to love the shepherd. But no doubt, one must also see it, like Oriental, Arab, and Persian poetry, as one of the consequences of the position created for women, which it will be important to examine, a question of convenience. Of Goethe's words, I would like above all to stress the admission they make concerning culture, or rather, let us say, concerning apprenticeship in heterosexuality. It may, in fact, be natural for the young human or the primitive human to seek vaguely contact and caresses, rather than precisely coitus, and for some, or even many people, to be more disconcerted and repelled by the mystery of another sex, now that the attraction of smell is no longer there to guide them. You see that I have dropped the argument against inferior beauty, because I do not think that sexual attraction need necessarily depend on it. No doubt, certain people will be irresistibly attracted by one sex rather than the other, as Aristophanes explains in Plato's Symposium. But I maintain that even the man who is exclusively attracted by the opposite sex will have considerable difficulty, when left entirely to his own devices, in daring to make the precise gesture. He will not always know how to invent it, and will at first show considerable awkwardness. Love has always guided the lover, a blind guide. And since you have introduced the word love, which I still wanted to keep in abeyance, I will add that the more a man is in love, the more awkward he will be. Yes, the more his physical desire is accompanied by real love, for since his desire is no longer entirely egotistical, he will be afraid of hurting the person he loves, and so long as he receives no instruction, by observing some example, of animals perhaps, or from some lesson, or from some preliminary initiation, perhaps by the woman herself. Good God! As though a man did not find sufficient response in the reciprocal desires of the woman he loved. I am no more convinced of that than Longus was. Do you remember the hesitations and mistakes of Daphnis? Doesn't he need this great, clumsy lover and experienced woman to instruct him? The clumsiness and hesitation you refer to were surely introduced to furnish this otherwise barren novel with a little suspense and excitement. Oh, no, for beneath the thin veneer of affectations I can recognize in this wonderful book the profound science of what de Gourmont calls the anatomy of love, and I maintain that the story of Daphnis and Chloe is a perfect example of naturalism. What do you claim to have established by this? That rustic lovers, not instructed by Theocritus, behaved more naively, that the instinct is often insufficient to resolve the enigma of the opposite sex. Practical application is necessary. A simple commentary on Goethe's words. And that is why in Virgil we see Damoetus sitting beneath the willows weeping for the loss of Galatea, while Menalcas takes pleasure in the company of Amyntas without reticence. At mihi sese offert ultro meus ignis Amyntas. When the lover is close to his friend, Leonardo da Vinci remarked, he is in repose. If heterosexuality requires some tuition, then you must admit that today in town and country there is no lack of teachers more precociously enlightened than Daphnis. Whereas nowadays, even in the country, or one might say particularly in the country, homosexual activity is fairly rare and is considered fairly disreputable. Yes, this is what we were saying the day before yesterday, that our laws and conventions all conspire to drive one sex towards the other. There is an open or secret conspiracy to make a boy believe, even before his desires are awakened, that all pleasure is to be experienced with women, and that without them there can be no pleasure at all. The fair sex's attractions are exaggerated to the point of absurdity, as opposed to the systematic effacement, distortion, and ridicule of the masculine. Against this, however, certain artistic people will revolt, people whose sense of form we have seen to be greater than their concern for convention, at some of the finest and most admired periods of history. I have already answered you on that point, by agreeing with Perrier, if I remember correctly, and expressing your admiration for woman's concern with self-adornment, whereby she attempts at all times and in all places to arouse man's desires, and so supplement the inadequacy of her beauty. Yes, what you call artificial attraction. What have you been able to prove? That adornment is becoming to women? Oh, excellent progress. There is nothing more unpleasant than a man who overdresses or who paints his face. Once again, a boy's beauty has nothing to do with paint. In Greek sculpture we have seen how superb it is when naked. But before condemning out of hand, you should make some allowance for Western conventions, for you cannot ignore the fact that the Orientals, amongst others, do not always share our opinions. Simply try dressing a boy up, offsetting his beauty instead of concealing it, and you may be able to judge the result by this passage from Montesquieu. In Rome, women do not appear on the stage. Castrati dressed as women are used instead. This has a very bad effect on morality, because there is nothing, that I know of, which does more to inspire Socratic love amongst the people of Rome. And further on, during my time at Rome, there were, at the Capranica Theatre, 2 little castrati, Mariotti and Chiostra, dressed as women, who were the most beautiful creatures I have ever seen in my life, and who would have inspired the tastes of Gomorrah in people least prone to this form of depravity. A young Englishman, believing that one of them was a woman, fell madly in love with him, and for more than a month remained the victim of this passion. Formerly, in Florence, the Grand Duke Cosimo III, out of infatuation, drew a similar inference. Imagine the effect this must have produced in Florence, which was, in this respect, the new Athens. Voyages 1, pages 220 and 221. And he goes on to quote in this connection the words of Horace, "Drive out what is natural, and it returns at the gallop. Naturam expelles furca, tamen recurrit," which we can interpret as we like. Now I begin to understand you properly. The natural for you is homosexuality, and what humanity still has the impertinence to consider the natural and normal relationship as between man and woman is regarded by you as the artificial. Now, have the courage to admit it. He was silent for a moment, and then said, "Of course it is easy to reduce my ideas to absurdity, but when in my book they are allowed to develop quite naturally from the premises we established earlier, I don't think they will appear so ridiculous." I then asked him to return to the subject of his book, which we seemed to have lost sight of for too long. He continued. 5. Yesterday I tried to show you that the dictates of the sexual instinct were far less compelling and precise in animals than people usually choose to believe. Then, from the diverse meanings loosely contained in the phrase sexual instinct, I attempted to disentangle the various elements, the sheer urgency of the organ itself, the variability of taste, and the reaction to an outside influence, the object of the instinct. I discovered that the different tendencies of this complex instinct were only compact and firmly welded together at the single instant when the smell of ovulation guided the male and drove him to coitus. Today I observe that men's senses were not dominated by smell, and that women, possessing no overwhelming power of persuasion, I mean the irresistible and momentary attraction of animals, can only claim to be constantly attractive, and that they wisely apply themselves to this end with the approval, encouragement, and assistance, at any rate in our Western countries, of law, convention, etc. I observed that artifice and dissimulation, the noble form of which is modesty, that decoration and dress, often come to the assistance of inadequate attraction. Is this to say that certain men would not be irresistibly attracted to women, or to one woman in particular, when stripped of finery? Certainly not, as we see that others, despite all the solicitations of the fair sex, the prescribed codes and the danger, still remain irresistibly attracted by boys. But I do maintain that in most cases the desire which awakens in the adolescent has no very precise urgency, that he experiences pleasure in whatever form it is offered, no matter by which sex, and that he owes his habits more to outside influences than to the promptings of his own desires. Or, if you prefer, I can put it this way, that desire rarely acquires precision on its own account and without the assistance of experience. It is rare for the first experiences to be dictated entirely by desire, even though they may be what desire itself would have chosen. There is no vocation more easily corrupted than the sexual, and so what? For I see the point you have reached. You are suggesting that if the adolescent were left entirely to himself, without the interference of moral upbraidings, or if, so to speak, civilization grew more lax, homosexuals would be even more numerous than they are. It is my turn to quote Goethe's words, "The victory that culture has gained at the expense of nature must not be surrendered or given up at any price."